The fog over the bay was a cold, wet shroud, clinging to the masts of the 3 Russian frigates anchored like gray specters. On the muddy plaza of Yerba Buena, Grand Duke Alexei stood on a platform of hastily arranged barrels, the double-headed eagle of his personal standard flapping heavily beside him. He was a tall man, his authority radiating not from pomp, but from the stark intensity in his eyes and the severe cut of his dark blue naval coat. His voice, honed by years of commanding men over the roar of wind and cannon, cut through the damp air. "You live here on the edge of the world," he boomed, his Russian accent thick but his Spanish surprisingly fluent, addressing the motley crowd of Mexican Californios, American traders, and his own sailors. "You are governed by a distant power in Mexico City that has forgotten you, and eyed by another in Washington that would consume you. I offer a third way, a Pacific destiny, a kingdom born of this coast, for this coast, a bastion of order, faith, and commerce, protected by the might of our fleet and the richness of this land. I sever my ties to the old world to build a new one with you. Today I am no longer just a Grand Duke of Russia. I am Alexei I, first Tsar of the Pacific." He drew his ceremonial sword, its gilded hilt flashing in the gray light, and pointed it not at the crowd, but towards the golden hills to the east. A promise and a challenge. The capital was no longer a muddy plaza. Tsargrad-on-the-Sea, built on the stunning bluffs of the Monterey Peninsula, was a city of impossible contrasts. The Royal Pacific Palace, with its sea-green onion domes and gilded spires, overlooked a harbor bustling with clipper ships and whalers. Cobblestone streets, named for saints and naval victories, were patrolled by the Tsar's Cossack guard, their papaka hats and red-striped trousers a startling sight against the backdrop of Monterey's cypress trees. In the Grand Market, Chinese silk merchants haggled with Russian fur traders, while the aroma of borscht and sourdough bread mixed in the salt-laced air. The aging Tsar Alexei, now white-bearded and walking with a whalebone cane, observed the scene from his balcony. His kingdom had survived. The gold rush had brought a flood of prospectors, whom he'd taxed and enlisted, turning their ambition into his treasury. He had forged treaties with local Ohlone tribes and outmaneuvered the fledgling American state of California, establishing the Sierra Nevada mountains as a hard border. His son, the Tsarevich Pavel, stood beside him, a man born on this soil, speaking English, Spanish, and Russian with equal fluency. The kingdom was a reality, a vibrant, bizarre, and fiercely independent entity. But to the east, the United States, now whole again after its civil war, was building a railroad, a steel spear aimed at the heart of his domain. Tsarevich Pavel, now a man of 30, reined in his horse at the summit of Donner Pass. He and his small contingent of Cossack scouts looked down into the east. The view was no longer one of pristine wilderness. A raw, red scar gashed its way through the forested foothills below, the end of the line for the Central Pacific Railroad, a temporary town of tents and clapboard shacks, teeming with thousands of Irish and Chinese laborers, surrounded the terminus. The rhythmic clang of sledgehammers on steel spikes carried faintly on the wind, a sound Pavel found more menacing than cannon fire. This was the vanguard of the United States, not an army with flags and bugles, but a relentless machine of commerce and migration. His father called it the Iron Serpent, a beast that would devour their land 1 mile at a time. The Americans claimed they were merely connecting their nation, but Pavel knew better. Every rail laid was a challenge, every hammer blow a declaration of intent. He saw a group of U.S. cavalry observing his party from a distant ridge, the glint of the sun on a spyglass a silent, mutual acknowledgement. The Cold War had begun. His father was old, and the kingdom's romantic isolation was ending. The world was coming for their Pacific paradise. Tsar Alexei was dead, and his son ruled as Tsar Pavel I. While Pavel focused on the external threat from the Yankees, a new danger grew within Tsargrad itself. In a cramped, ink-stained print shop tucked away in the American Quarter, a man named Samuel Keene checked the lock on his door. By day, he printed shipping manifests and newspapers loyal to the Tsar. By night, he printed sedition. Samuel was the son of a Boston merchant who'd come for gold and stayed. He'd grown up in the kingdom, but he'd been educated on the forbidden texts of Jefferson and Paine, smuggled over the mountains. He and his small circle of Republicans saw the Tsar not as a protector, but as a tyrant, a gaudy relic of a dead European age. He taxes without representation, Samuel whispered to his fellow conspirators, their faces illuminated by a single lantern. He maintains a standing army to watch his own people. He demands we bow to his icons and his bloodline. What is that but chains, gilded though they may be? He held up a freshly printed pamphlet. On the cover was a simple, powerful image, a broken crown. The Americans to the east offer a different future, a government of the people. It is time for the citizens of the Pacific to choose. The printing press, the kingdom's tool of communication, was now being turned into a weapon against it. The flashpoint was not a battle, but a string of copper wire. The United States government, under the guise of improving communications, ran a telegraph line to the border outpost near Lake Tahoe, demanding the kingdom allow it to be extended to Tsargrad for diplomatic and commercial purposes. Tsar Pavel refused. To him, that wire was a leash that would tie his independent capital to Washington's political whims. He saw it as a tool for American spies and agitators like Samuel Keene. In response, a pro-American mob, secretly incited and funded by Keene's Republicans and sympathetic American businessmen, stormed the kingdom's border station. They tore down the double-headed eagle flag and hoisted the stars and stripes over the small customs house. The local boyar, a noble governor, panicked and sent in a squad of Cossacks to restore order. In the confused, violent melee, a rock was thrown, a shot was fired, and 3 American citizens, part of the mob, were killed. The news flew across the new telegraph wire. In Washington, newspapers, hungry for expansion, screamed of a Pacific massacre. "Innocent Americans slaughtered by Tsar's thugs," shouted the headlines. The pretext they had been waiting for had arrived. Congress began to debate a formal declaration of war. Tsar Pavel I stood before the great map of his kingdom in the palace's amber room, a breathtaking chamber paneled entirely in carved amber, a gift from his grandfather's era. The warm, golden light gave the illusion of peace, a stark contrast to the grim faces of his war council. On one side stood the old guard, grizzled, bearded boyars and the aging General Orlov, men who had fought alongside Alexei I. "We fortify the passes," Orlov rasped, his hand tracing the line of the Sierra Nevada on the map. "Let them break themselves upon our mountains as the French broke themselves on the Russian winter. Our Cossacks know every trail. We bleed them dry." On the other side stood the modernists, led by the young, English-educated Prince Dmitri, the Tsar's cousin. "General, their cannons can now fire over your mountains," Dmitri countered, his voice sharp. "Their Gatling guns will shred our cavalry before they can even draw their sabers. We cannot win a war of attrition. We must use the treasury, hire mercenaries, buy modern artillery from the British or the Germans, and seek a diplomatic alliance. We must show them the cost of this war will be too high for their Congress to stomach." Tsar Pavel listened, the weight of his father's legacy and his people's future pressing down on him. Fight like a Russian bear or play the game of nations like a European king. The choice would determine their survival. The War of the Pacific began not with a grand siege, but in the high desert east of the Sierras. General Orlov got his wish for a defensive war. He positioned his forces, a mix of Cossack cavalry and loyalist militia, along the Truckee River, daring the American Army of the West to cross. The Americans, led by a hardened Civil War veteran, General Miles, did not attempt a frontal assault. They used their numbers and superior logistics, while their main force pinned Orlov with relentless artillery fire that echoed for miles. A second column made a wide flanking march through terrain the old boyars had deemed impassable. The kingdom's forces fought with ferocious bravery. The Cossacks, with their wild cavalry charges and deadly skill with the Shashka saber, were terrifying opponents up close. But they were charging into the teeth of disciplined rifle volleys and the stuttering roar of Gatling guns. For every American soldier who fell, 3 more seemed to take his place. By the second day, Orlov's flank was collapsing. He saw his beloved cavalry, the pride of the kingdom, being systematically annihilated from a distance. The strategy of the old world had met the industrial might of the new, and it was breaking. The retreat, when it came, was a bloody, chaotic scramble back to the mountain passes. The gateway to the kingdom was now open. The great fortress of Pavel's Peak, a bastion carved into the granite of Donner Pass and thought to be impregnable, held out for 3 months. It was the kingdom's Thermopylae, a symbol of defiance against the overwhelming American advance. Prince Dmitri, having proven his tactical sense, was given command of its defense. He used the terrain brilliantly, staging ambushes and rockslides, making the Americans pay for every foot of ground. But the U.S. Army engineers were relentless. They built new roads, hauled massive siege cannons up impossible slopes, and laid miles of telegraph wire, coordinating a multi-pronged assault. The end came from within. Samuel Keene, the Republican printer, saw his moment. Using his network, he smuggled messages to a boyar in the fortress garrison, a man who had lost his sons at the Truckee and blamed the Tsar's hubris. Promised amnesty and a powerful position in the new California. The boyar sabotaged the fortress's main well and signaled the Americans. As disease and thirst weakened the defenders, the U.S. Army launched its final massive assault. Prince Dmitri fought until he was captured, his uniform torn and face blackened by gunpowder. The double-headed eagle was torn down, and the Stars and Stripes was raised over the highest peak of the Sierras, visible for miles. The mountain had fallen. The road to Tsargrad was clear. The siege of Tsargrad-on-the-Sea was a slow, agonizing strangulation. The U.S. Navy blockaded the harbor, its modern, ironclad warships a stark contrast to the elegant but obsolete frigates of the kingdom. On land, the army's artillery shells began to fall on the city's outskirts. Tsar Pavel I refused all offers of surrender that did not guarantee his dynasty's continued, if nominal, rule. Washington refused. Inside the Royal Pacific Palace, the sound of distant explosions was a constant, dull percussion. Pavel, looking haggard and thin, gathered his family and his few remaining loyal courtiers in the palace's private chapel, a jewel box of gold leaf and dark icons. The priest began the Orthodox liturgy, his deep chants a fragile shield of sound against the encroaching doom. Pavel looked at his young son, Alexei II, a boy of 10 who would never rule. He saw the faces of his people, the unique culture he had sworn to protect, now facing dissolution. He was no longer a king defending a border. He was a father watching his home be destroyed. As the chanting reached its crescendo, a shell screamed overhead and struck the palace's western wing. The entire chapel shuddered, dusting them with plaster. The liturgy did not stop. They continued to pray, a final act of defiance in a world that no longer had room for them. Tsargrad was now Monterey, California again, but a version of it that existed nowhere else. The onion domes of the palace, now a government building and tourist attraction, gleamed under the American flag. The street names remained a confusing mix of Russian and Spanish. You could buy a hot dog from a vendor near a statue of a stern-looking Grand Duke Alexei. Tsar Pavel had died in exile in Hawaii. His son, Alexei, lived quietly in Paris, the pretender of the Pacific, a historical curiosity. Prince Dmitri, after being released from a prisoner of war camp, had chosen to stay. He was now a history professor at the new Stanford University, a quiet, respected man with a slight accent and sad eyes. He often walked the wharves of Monterey, watching the fishing boats. He saw the last of the Cossack families, their children now speaking only English, their traditions fading into folklore. The kingdom was gone, absorbed into the fabric of America. It was a footnote, a failed state, a romantic dream. But for Dmitri, and for the few who remembered, it had been real. It had been a place where the Pacific had its own voice, its own crown, its own soul. Now it was just another story told to tourists, a ghost on the Golden Coast. The great what-if of the American West.